All right. So the takeaways, I would like to believe that you will understand what the issues with the traditional software development. When I say traditional software development, that includes the agile practice, a quick BDD overview for someone who's not familiar with BDD, but it'll be a very quick overview. How you can save cost using BDDs and no-code BDD. And finally, how I'll show you a case study of how Quantumix.ai, it's a very data intensive application, have managed to reduce their cost by more than 37.5%. All right. So recently, I'm building an extension for my house. I don't know how familiar you are with something called Orangery. That's what I'm trying to put for my house. And the building process is what? You take your requirements, you discuss with your architect, you bring in a builder, you also bring in an architect, and you put all the plans together, you show them examples. This is what I would like. Let's say if I want an orangery, you show them examples like images, or you may go to your neighbor's house, or you can tell the builder, can you show me some examples? Then you agree on the design. The architect comes up with the design. You say, yeah, it looks good. I want the window here, things like that. And the builder also gives us input. We all three of us agree. And we also bring in any other people who might involve, maybe an electrician. I brought in an electrician that day. The builder was there, architect was there. I told what I need, where all the plug points, what all the issues the electricians might have. All that was discussed. Then I agree on the cost, then the plan. Then I get an extension like that. Imagine if I do this way, I give my requirements to the architect, he passes on to say a plumber, then to an electrician, then to the builder, then I might end up a construction like this, So it sounds ridiculous, right? But that's what we seem to be doing in traditional SDLC, whether it's agile or waterfall, the approach is similar. So the product owner gives the user story to the developer takes it, develops the code, and then gives it to the QA. The worst case, the QA does some manual testing. Best case, they do some automation testing, or they call it as BDD testing, which itself is an oxymoron. Then passes on the bugs. The developer thinks it's not a bug, so they have a lot of discussion. Then they go for clarifying the requirement. At that point, the product owner says, that's not what I was expecting. Or even the worst case, during the demo, the product owner says, no, this is not what I was expecting. You can imagine the time that's lost due to this process, and also the cost. You might have seen this graph. As you might notice, as you might know, the later you find any issues, the higher the cost is. Because during the requirement, if you understand well, if the bugs are discussed, or even if the requirements are discussed thoroughly, then the cost is very low because everyone understands the rework is less. The later the stage, the worse it gets. The worst case is when you find things in production. You might have heard news that so and so company have lost millions because of this bug. That's the production issues. Even in integration testing, if someone finds, fixing that is expensive because already you've lost all the time going into integration testing, and then the number of people involved, then the rework, and if it's a large organization, then the approval, all that, it gets really, really expensive. So how do you avoid it? You bring in BDD. A lot of people think BDD is as an automation testing tool. It is not. The most important aspect about BDD is collaboration. You collaboratively work together to understand the requirement, derive the requirements, then use that requirement to develop your software and to develop your testing process. In fact, BDD allows you to derive those requirements and execute those requirements. I'll cover that in a minute. That's why it's sometimes called executable specifications. So for an example, the three amigos sit together, they collaborate, they formulate scenarios. If you want, you can bring on other team members. Recently, we did a project. It's a very architecturally heavy project, more than a functional. The architect gives a lot more input into it. So what we did was, as part of our BDD collaboration and formulation, Other than the three amigos, we also made sure that the architect was present during the formulation of the scenarios process. So it's quite important. You also bring in other team members, but the three amigos are must. Then you derive scenarios. In BDD, you can write scenarios, which I'll show some examples in a minute. Then what you do is the developer takes the scenarios. Now everyone is on the same page. The developer exactly knows these are all the scenarios I need to implement. And the QA takes those scenarios and starts automating. So because everyone is on the same page, the chance of understanding the requirement is remote, very, very less compared to the traditional way of doing it. So think about using BDD scenarios upfront in your life cycle. So what you can consider is instead of writing user stories, you need to start writing BDD scenarios. But the challenge you can see is, which I've seen in many projects, is it is difficult to make a cultural change. I've heard this and I've also experienced this, because if the organization is so used to writing user stories, as a team, it may be very, very difficult to move them away from user stories to write BDD scenarios. So in those situations, what I tend to do is I still take the user stories, but I have my own collaboration technique with the team. From the user stories, we derive BDD scenarios. So think about having a box in the front. That would be the user story. From that, you derive BDD scenarios with your team. Then you start development and testing. Okay, just a quick overview about BDD. No, from a writing BDD scenarios perspective, there's not much to learn. You need to learn something called Gherkin language. It's nothing but your natural language. It has certain keywords, that's all you need to understand. Given, when, then, and, but. Given, when, and then are the most used keywords. So I'm just going to cover that. Given is basically, it sets up your context. So for an example, if you're loading a website or initializing system, or you want to set up the data, you basically do that in the given. So given tells you that, okay, it's a context. You're setting up, to do something. For an example, let's say you want to do something on the user data. Let's say you want to update the user data. In order to update, you need to have the user data upfront. So you do that in the given step. You say, given the user exists in the database, then you do something. The when step is what you actually do that action. So when I update the user, or when the admin update the user. So the when is the one which actually does the action. The then step is what does the checks. It asserts the result. So it checks the result and makes sure, okay, the system is behaving as I expect. So that's all you need to understand from a BDD overview. So I've given a lot of example. As you can see, I've given user as logged in, given Joe as a balance of $40. So in that example, let's say I can take given Joe as a balance of $40. When Joe transfers $42 to Sandy, then the system should show an error message saying you don't have enough credit in your account, something like that. So some of the examples of the given, when, and then. So as I mentioned, you need to move away from user stories. Let's look at how you can move away from user stories. So what you do is initially you take BDD. Let's say this is an user story, typical user story. As a mobile developer, blah, blah, blah. These are my acceptance criteria, right? So what you do is you take the user story or the requirement. You formulate the scenarios. You don't write like how it's written here. It's just, a bunch of text, which may be clear in the person who has written this, but not necessarily clear for everyone. So what you do is you take the scenarios, discuss with the team, bring in all the team members and say, okay, what is the scenarios we are trying to do? The first scenario, the domain expert or the person who's writing the story, typically the BA or the product owner will come and say, okay, when mobile app developer calls a user API, blah, 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 I need to get all this information so that the mobile app developer can go and build the mobile app. Okay, that's fine. That's one scenario. The second scenario is, okay, if I pass another page ID, then I should get a lot more data. Then the third scenario is what happens if the page ID doesn't exist? Then you should say, okay, you send error information, or you just send a support level detail information. So these are some of the scenarios, but you can derive scenarios as much as you want. You also need to think about both positive and negative scenarios, and also think about the edge cases. My suggestion would be don't restrict on deriving the scenarios. If you think, OK, this is never going to happen, or this is no, you can ignore those scenarios. But if it's rarely going to happen, you can still have those scenarios, but tag them saying, edge cases, because you can decide whether to handle that edge cases now, or you can put it in your backlog. But it's important during this process, because all the discussions happening around this process and this requirement, it's important you capture everything as much as you can. Then once the scenarios are defined, you expand it even further. OK, in order for me to achieve whatever the scenario says, what should I do? Then you bring in the BDD steps. Like when user API is called with page ID as 1, then all values, including avatar name, email ID, blah, 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 all that should, should be returned. Sorry, someone has joined. So you expand your scenarios. I've expanded all the 3 scenarios. For the brevity of this meeting, I haven't gone for a larger scenarios, but hopefully you'll understand what the scenarios means. So you expand the scenarios, into proper BDD step using given, when, and then. This is your final step. So the first step is understand the requirement, collaborate with your team, write the scenarios. Then you expand the scenario saying, OK, what are all the information I need? What are all the steps I need to do in order to achieve that scenarios? Once scenarios are done, a couple of slides back, I mentioned it's executable specification. As you can see, I've written the scenarios and I have actually executed it. That's one of the beauty about BDD. You don't see it anywhere, because if you take a typical requirement, for an example, this one, I can't execute this. I just have to go with whatever the demo gives, the user gives it to me. But in this case, I've written my requirement and actually I'm executing it to check whether the system meets my requirement. That's a real benefit of using BDD. OK, there's a catch in using BDD. I've been using BDD for God knows for how long. It's quite a long time now. Many projects have gone. Everybody loves BDD because it's cross-functional. You bring in everyone on the same page. The chance of misunderstanding the requirement is less. The chance of finger pointing is less. It brings the team together very nicely. The product owner loves it because he understands what the team is trying to do, because it's in common language. The developer likes it because the scenarios are explained nicely. Scenarios are explained nicely in the way that the developer wants, and the QA likes it because as many of you may be from the QA world, you will understand that most of the time the requirement is not even told to the QA, and it is frustrating. But with BDD, because everyone is on the same page and everyone has an opportunity to participate in the requirement, everyone understands it well, and that becomes this scenarios that you write, that becomes your contract. So if someone comes and says, oh, that let's say the developer comes and says, oh, that's not what I was looking. You can look at that scenario and say, look, this is what we have agreed. Let's go with that. And same for the QA as well. If the QA comes and says, OK, it's not working as expected, the developer can look at the scenario and say, OK, now this is what we have agreed, and the system is working as per the scenarios. So that becomes your contract. But the disadvantage of BDD is it is expensive. Because for every step that's written here, if it's not reused, you have to write some sort of code behind it. And that can quickly grow and it can get expensive. So typically, if you're planning to deliver an automated BDD within a sprint, my experience is the team spends anywhere between 40 to 50% just on automation. And because it's expensive, sometimes it is difficult to justify. Though you're spending 40 to 50%, it's still justifiable because either the manual test or even some other automation will be more expensive than this, but still it's quite expensive. It is time consuming. Typically, I've seen the automation script takes more than 70% of the entire development. Let's say if the developer says it will take 10 days, the BDD automation scripts might take, about 7 days. There is a high cost of maintenance. What I've experienced is it's for many reasons. What I've experienced is the code grows very quickly because the code is also doesn't go into production. A lot of best practices don't get followed. And there's no proper code review. As a result, the cost of maintenance is very high. And I've seen many projects, people justifying saying, oh, we don't need the same standard as the production code for BDD code because it's never going into production. But please remember, your BDD code will be maintained as long as your production code. That's your regression pack. That's the one which tells any changes you make to the production code is as working and is not affected something else. So that argument is quite false. So the maintenance is also quite high. So I've also seen this, the QA engineers who get involved and writing the code, end up spending so much time on coding and less time on actual testing. That's combination of for various reasons. One is maybe the QA engineers is still understanding coding, so it is taking time. Or even if they are familiar, with coding, we all know that you will get stuck at some point. You may not know, it may be an environment issue, maybe some other issue, maybe you haven't initialized a variable. So as a result, the testing time gets narrowed and narrowed. For an example, if the QA engineer is given, let's say, 7 days to test a particular, a bunch of BDD scenarios. Let's say if in their head, if they thought, okay, I'm going to take about 3 or 4 days to automate, and then rest of the days I'm going to use that automation to test it properly and also do some edge case testing. When they code, it gets extended and extended. So let's say they spend another day or two on additional, because of some coding issues, they've spent additional day or two. Now that window for testing has narrowed. So as a result, they've compromised something on the testing. This is a very interesting issue. I don't know if you have noticed, but pretty much in all projects I've seen this. Because the software development engineer as test are expensive, companies, what they do is they take either the existing QA or someone new and train them on coding and put them as an automation tester. What happens is once they get to know more and more about coding, they really like the idea of coding, so they want to convert into a dev role. As a result, we have lost a lot of good test engineers. I don't know if you have seen that in your project, but I've seen in many projects, and we continuously lose those test engineers because they move into a dev role, which is not a bad thing because that's what they've decided for their career path, and we also get good developers. But that also means that we have to go and fill that SDET role. So this is an important point that you need to think about when doing, when embarking on BDD journey. And resources are hard to find. You can do a quick search. You can also look at Glassdoor, which tells about the average salary. The average salary paid for SDET are more than devs, proper SDET I'm talking about. And the resources, the good automation engineers or the BDD automation engineers are difficult to find. So I've seen this disadvantages in many projects and, realized, okay, that's putting off many people in embarking on BDD journey, and myself, I found it very difficult. So what I did was I went and created NoCodeBDD. The idea is, as the name says, you can automate BDD without any coding. And it's fairly straightforward. It just, as what it says in the tin, you can automate pretty much all the BDD scenarios without having to write any code in minutes. I'll show you show you now a simple scenario how I'm going to automate an API. So for an example, let's say simple API. So let's say scenario happy path to messages. Let's say when I call an API, I'm just going to use a public API with required info. Then the response from the API should match my expectation. Cutting down all the requirement details, but let's say I'm just going to use request. So I'm just going to use this, just a simple API. So as you can see, this is what you write in your BDD as your requirement. For each of this line, you have to go on, if you're using Java, which is what my background is, for each of this line, you have to go and write a method. For an example, in this line, I have to go call a REST API, do all the coding. Then in that, I have to get the REST API assert response and then assert the value. But with NoCodeBDD, all you have to do is go to step definitions, go to new step definition. As you can see, we support a lot of things. We support REST, MQ, SQL, UI, and custom code. In this case, I'm just going to call a REST API. In this step, the first step, because I'm going to call the REST API, I'm going to send the API request. And if you have used API, this screen may be very familiar to you because this is very similar to Postman. So I've just mentioned the API that I want to call. Then in the next step, as you can see in the then step, where I want to set the expected value, then I have to call again the REST. In this case, I want to assert the value and response message. All I have to do is just copy this response message and save it. So that's all done. So just go to, that's all, I've done my automation now. And then run the step. That should go through. As you can see, it will also give you all the details that the REST has been, and it also show you what the difference is. There are no differences in this case, but if there are differences, it will show you. For an example, let's say you are expecting a value of, let's say George, instead of George, let's say I'm going to say Jerome, and then save it. Then go to run. If you come here, it'll show you what the differences are. So you now automating your BDDs, like literally, few clicks away, and you can pretty much automate everything, and including your edge cases. Let's say if that is something that you do where we don't support at all, we have something called custom code. So you can actually write the code and you can call it from there. We are also planning to include various other modules. So we currently cover REST, database, UI. You don't need to write any Selenium. I'll show you in a minute. MQ. We are also planning to add NoSQL and RabbitMQ. And we'll continue to add modules as we go along. So that's NoCodeBDD. So how Quantumx used BDD and NoCodeBDD to reduce their cost. So what they've done is Quantumx AI. It's an interesting company. They do a lot of data analytics work. So their idea is anyone can become a data engineer. What they do is check out the website. What they do is the application is quite, as the name says, it's AI and quite powerful. It is very data intensive. So that's the reason why I've taken this case study. It's not a typical website where you go fill up some details and then save it into a database and send that. We do support those kind of companies as well. But because QuantumX is quite data intensive, I've taken that as a case study. We have been working with them. So what they used to have is they used to have a large QA team and the dev team, but they really struggled in terms of their testing and meeting the targets, and also keeping everyone on the same page. So they basically we engaged with them, had meetings and several workshops in making sure that they follow the right BDD process. So as a result, what they did was they completely turned it around. Instead of the product owner giving them the requirement, and the BA takes the requirement, talks to the development team, and the development team completes the requirement, then the testing team takes it. The testing team was not even talking to the product owner. So what happened was, as a result, there were a lot of issues in the application, because when they came to the demo to the product owner, it was not what he was expecting. So with a lot of workshops and other things, we brought everyone together. We brought in the three amigos. We showed them how to derive requirements using BDD process. We also brought in some technique called OOPSI. It's derived by someone called the industry experts called Jenny Martin and Pete Buckney. So I've been using OOPSI for ages now. It's a brilliant technique. Feel free to go and search it, or if you want, I can send you more information. And if a lot of you are interested, I can have a separate session on it. It's absolutely brilliant technique to derive your BDD scenarios, and also to keep everyone on the same page. What I've found it to be very useful is, typically in a collaboration process, the person who speaks the loudest is the one who carries the entire collaboration process. The other people are just silent spectators. With OOPSI, it brought actually the entire team, and it had it had sessions where everyone had to collaborate. It is done in such a way that the product owner, the QA, the developer all have to pitch in. They don't have a choice. In that way, it actually brought in and made sure that everyone understand the process really well. So we brought that in. As a result, they've started using our product, NoCodeBDD. So as a result, they had this split. They've now recently moved to 7 devs and 1 QA. They in fact, they just kept their BA as the BA role, and they've kept 1 QA because they needed that. And the automation testers, they willingly went into a development role. That's one of our success story. Also, the time to market has reduced quite a lot, because for about 30 scenarios, they were taking about 96 hours, but now it's just 8 hours. In 30 scenarios, that day we saw that automation engineer just finished it in about 8 hours. Because there is absolutely no coding to do. It's all just click and play. As you can see, I just automated. I know it's a simple API call, but imagine doing that in code. I've just automated in less than a minute. So this is one of their scenario. It's something called cleansing rule. It's what it does is, there are other complicated scenarios as well, but as you can see, what it does is it logs on to their website. It uploads a file, and whatever the file, CSV file, whatever the CSV file is uploaded, it's shown to the user. Then they have a rule called cleansing rule. So they apply the rule. What it does is it goes to the CSV file, removes all the duplicate, and then shows the removed values in the screen. And all the requirement is, they want to make sure whatever shown in the screen is also whatever saved in the file after the cleansing rule happens. This video shows how it's done. There is absolutely no Selenium code or anything. It's all done through just how I showed you. You just have to provide some information. NoCodeBDD will take care of it. So as you can see, I'm just skipping all the steps, setting up part. So as you can see, the website gets loaded and then login happens. Then it goes to the relevant place, the folder and then it creates the folder. Then the file gets uploaded. It's all automated. No, nothing is manual. So file gets uploaded and then the cleansing rule gets applied. So apply duplicate cleanse rule. So it just removes all the duplicate rows from the Excel CSV file. As you can see, the file is loaded and then the code finishes. As you can see, we can see all the element ID, everything that we passed. So it's, it's wonderful when we see that it's working. Any questions? Anything you'd like to go through?
Some questions?
Yeah, sure.
Like as you mentioned, we are doing the BDD, and whatever we are writing in a BDD is necessary to automate, or is it a way to just develop the product?
It's a very good point. So what I've seen that Gupta and my experience is that from Gupta?
Yeah.
What my experience is when you use scripted BDDs, automation. Let's say you are using code to automate your BDDs. It is definitely worth parking some of the BDDs. Let's say you have edge cases, as you've discovered during your discovery process. You've discovered scenarios which you think and agree with your team. That's most important. You agree with your team that these are edge cases. Then it may be worth parking those scenarios because the automation does take time if you're using scripted. If you're going to use NoCodeBDD, I would say go and automate pretty much everything because it doesn't take any time. But even that, you can be considerate on some of the scenarios because even with working with Quantumx, few of them get excited and they'll come up with some obscure scenarios which the team agrees it's never going to happen. In those, you just write the scenarios, you don't worry about it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, somewhat. But like, for example, BDD is only applicable for when we write a BDD, some things could be covered in unit tests. Something can be covered through integration and.
Oh, yeah. Okay, that question. Okay, there's a difference between your unit test and your BDD. There will always be overlap. But just because you have covered that in unit test, that doesn't mean that you don't cover that in your BDD. Just because something is covered in your integration, that doesn't mean that you should not cover in BDD. That should not be the criteria. The BDD scenarios are basically your requirements. You take your requirements as your scenarios and you write your automated test. The unit testing is purely a developer's tool. Unit testing you write so that you can write a better code, a high quality code, and you can come up with a better design. That's completely different from your BDD. BDD is a collaborative process and a collaborative methodology where you can write your.
Yeah, let me give an example. What we followed, we tried with the BDD. Example, there are some example that in a name field you can fill some kind of a format at the rate or length of the email ID and these kind of things.
Yeah.
You need to test these in with the BDD. The unit test can easily check all those things, the single functions. So for me, I tried BDD, then I thought, okay, these can we go to the lower level instead of testing at the UI level. UI level, we try to check a lot of things as an integrating a lot of things together.
No, the important point is, yes, you can test that at the unit level, but at the UI level, what you are trying to achieve. So does your requirement says the user has to fill all this information and needs to be persisted into a database successfully. If that's the case, yes, you need to follow that through the BDD. Your unit test is at the low level, as you mentioned, and it just checks whether the format that gets passed from UI into your code is correct. It just unit test just checks that, but your BDD checks not only the data that gets passed from your UI, it also checks whether the data gets persisted correctly in the database.
Okay.
There will be overlap. There is no question about it.
That's what I'm struggling sometime. I use BDD, then I see overlap in unit level and API level.
So
Then
don't see that as an overlap because these two are completely different. Your TDD, test-driven development, is purely for the developers. It's nothing to do with BDD. The developers take it in order to produce a better output and a better code. They write their unit test, then they implement the code, then they refactor the code, and they keep doing this in cycle till they are happy. BDD is a cross-functional team. You agree on something upfront, then someone goes and says, okay, these are the things I want to automate, and they will automate. There will be overlap, but it's nothing to do with whether I should use this or whether I should use that. In order for you to produce a high quality product or a software, you need to use both.
okay. And one more thing, like, do you see BDD as a source of truth for the requirement? Like, do you see the practical example where people say, okay, you just go check BDD and that's how my application work. You don't need.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's how I would do. I know some projects don't do, but wherever I go and roll out BDD, that's what I say. That's my single source of truth, because I can't execute my user requirements. But BDD I can execute and show them, look, my requirement is working fine, and that becomes my single source of truth.
And how do you maintain that? Are you maintain the code repository or have a separate tool or some Word document? How do you?
Sorry, what do you mean by how do I maintain it?
Like for example, if there is a user story and there is a BDD already I define in somewhere in the, let's say, Word document, and if yeah,
Okay.
where do you maintain these things?
Excellent question. Do you use Jira?
Yeah.
Okay. So in the current project, what we have done is they don't have a practice of, it's a government project, so they're not used to the product owners are not used to BDD scenarios and things like that. So what we brought in is the practice we brought in is they still give us the user story. The user stories are written in Jira, right? So the Jira has a number. For each user story, we have a exact mapping with the same number. We map the BDD features with the same numbers. Does that make sense? So for an example, let's look at this. Let's look at this cleanse rules. What you would do is, in this case, you will prefix the cleanse rules with the Jira ID of the user story. So let's say, for an argument's sake, the Jira ID is Jira 001 for cleanse rule user story. This cleanse rule will prefix with Jira 001. So you exactly know which BDD feature belongs to which story. That's how you do the mapping.
That's how you maintain. There could be many plugins. And regarding the no-code BDD, is it can be integrated in the pipelines?
Yes, yes, yeah, we do have CI/CD pipeline.
Okay, and let's see I'm more interested in complicated scenario and API. Maybe you cover it later in your demo, I think.
Yeah, you can do any complicated scenario. Ping me whatever API you want, and I can give you a demo on that.
And you can also run some kind of like, we don't want to directly go to connect with a database. Let's say running a wire mock or mock server, something we can do, or
see mocks. Okay, if you want to use mock, you can. It's nothing to do with NoCodeBDD. You configure in such a way that NoCodeBDD talks to your mock instead of the database.
Okay.
But typically, what I've seen is, when you use BDD, my suggestion would be to use proper database instead of mocks. You can consider mocks. The only place where I would recommend considering mocks is if you are using, let's say, if you are dependent on a third-party service, or if you are integrating with a different application within your organization who may not be ready. And in those cases, yes, you can certainly consider mocks, but within your application, I wouldn't use mocks.
Currently, we have a dependency like someone provide test environment. So before deploying on end-to-end environment, I need to make sure I test first with my mock server via mock or Mockito something.
Yeah.
Then I deploy on end-to-end to have a less bugs there. So currently, this is the situation.
Okay.
That's the model I use. Yeah. Thanks for your answer. Really nice explanation.
No worries.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions? Or do you want me to go through the presentation? Any other slides? We've got still about 15 minutes.
I see some question in chat.
Sorry, I missed the chat. Someone has put up their hand up.
Can you hear me there?
Sorry, who?
Hi, Shiva here.
Hi, Shiva.
Yeah, I have a quick question here. Okay, when you say the BDD, okay, the way the structure the behavior driven is being derived. Okay, we do have. I'm audible, right?
Yeah, you are.
Okay. The way it is derived, we have the scenarios. Then we do have the step definition, which and we have the test runner, right? Which get integrated through the glues and everything, right? When you do the step definition, it's more likely doing a unit testing, right? You're trying to run the code, you're trying to get the snippets, kind of test driven itself, right? But before you pointed out that the TDD is completely different, like the the aspects of TDD is totally different when it compares to the BDD. But there is an implementation within the BDD as well of unit testing, right?
No, it's not unit testing, Shiva. The unit testing is different from TDD to start with. TDD is your methodology. It's your test-driven development. Part of that you write unit test. It is, as the name suggests, it just tests the unit of that application. For an example, let's say if I'm testing something to add to a database. Let's say I want to add 5 fields. 5 fields are mandatory. Let's say one of the field has to have certain format. What I do is, as a developer, I write the code. Before I write the code, I write my unit tests. I say, okay, if this particular field doesn't have this format, fail the test. And if all the fields are not available, fail the test. So you write all your unit, basically all your unit tests. Then you write your code. So each of the tests passes. You don't actually write to the database. You write mocks. In that case, you can use Mockito to mock as if it's going into the database, and that's it. But BDD is different. BDD is you write your requirement at the start and then say when the user or API, in this case, maybe when the API sends these 5 information, I want to see that information stored in the database. Then you write another scenario saying, I want to send this particular format in the API, then the API should give me an error message. So these are all the information you cover. You cover at the behavior level, not at the unit level. So that implementation is different.
Okay, so I think I need to make a correction there. When you say we are using a TDD, so in behavior driven also, assuming we are using the Cucumber as they're doing the behavior driven, so there is a usage of TDD. That's what you meant to say. Right?
No,
but it's not
there is no usage of TDD. TDD is completely different. Just because the name sounds similar, they are not same. TDD is completely different. TDD is purely a developer's tool, and the developer uses to produce a better product, a better software. BDD is a cross-functional. It's used at the high level. They are not same. In Cucumber, yes, you will be writing code in order to make sure your automation script works, but that doesn't mean that that's your TDD.
All right. Thank you.
Welcome. And by the way, go to NoCodeBDD blog. I've written a very detailed description about the difference between BDD and TDD. There's a blog around BDD and TDD. If you want, I can send the link to that.
No. I made a visit to your site already. So I'll go to the resource section and I'll go through my readings. I'll do that.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I've got a couple of questions. NoCodeBDD applies to browser-based solution only, right? From Puxatak. I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Yes, it is. It is only for browser-based applications only at this point. Yeah, we don't support mobile or any other UI-based applications. Does that answer your question?
Yep. Thank you.
Okay. And from Michael, can I write BDD? Can I write a BDD test before I start coding? For example, before I have a URL? Yes, you can write BDD scenarios, not test. So yes, certainly, because that's your requirement. So that will be your first process. In fact, you start writing before you start, even touching your code. You can start writing your BDD scenarios. It has to be nothing to do with the implementation. You can do it before you have any URL, before you have any database or anything.
So the way to use this tool properly is to write the scenarios and then give that to the developer. And then when he's come up with something, I can then maybe produce a test that doesn't sound right.
Sorry, I'm struggling to hear you, Michael.
Okay. So what you're saying then is the process I should follow is to just begin by listing the features and within the feature give some scenarios, but that's as far as I can go until I've got some code to actually create some tests against. Yes,
the automation, you can still go ahead with your automation, but you can't run it because obviously it will fail. But during your BDD discovery process, if you are using OOPSI, I think I might have to think about OOPSI covering in a separate session. But if you are using some sort of technique like OOPSI, what you will discuss is you will discuss upfront. Okay, these are all the URLs that we are going to use. These are all the values I'm going to pass it. And you will already agree what the URL pattern is going to look like, what are the values it's going to be passed. Let's say in this case, if you are going to use API, you will also agree what is the API, what are the parameters you are going to pass upfront. So when the team goes back and implement, they exactly know what they're going to get. And the QA can still go ahead and start automating because you have agreed these are the values I'm going to use, but they can't run it.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome. From Gupta, can you please share link of OOPC way of writing? Oh, OOPSI. So that's called OOPSI. There is a blog in my website explaining about OOPSI. So the blog is something like move away from user story to BDD scenarios. But I will send as part of after this meetup. Okay. Any other question? I see Gupta typing. Oh, thanks. Sorry. No worries, Gupta. Any other questions? Can it be possible to give a quick note? What is OOPSI? Okay, I've got like few minutes. Yes, Shiva. So OOPSI is an acronym. It stands for O stands for outcome, O stands for output, P stands for process, S stands for scenarios, and I stands for input. So what it does is as I mentioned, the OOPSI, the O is the outcome. So outcome is your business outcome. So it first focuses on business outcome. So let's say your product owner comes, or in other cases, you have your user story with you. You take the user story, you first focus on what is the business outcome, because many teams forgets that they are writing software to achieve a business outcome. So OOPSI puts the importance on that. So you focus on business outcome. So you agree with your team what is the business outcome. So typically that outcome is the meeting is driven by, let's say, a product owner or the domain expert who gives the requirement. Then you discuss what the output is. What are all the output I need in order to achieve that outcome? Let's say that the outcome says, if we need to send an invoice to the customer, your output should be sending an email with an invoice, or however you want to send that invoice to the customer. So that is one of your output. The other output could be storing the values in the database. The other output could be sending a message to an invoicing application. So these are all the discussion you need to have. So the team gets involved and discuss, okay, in order to achieve that business outcome, what are the output I need? Then the developer jumps in and say, okay, in order to achieve these output, this is the process. In fact, you do the process flow diagram in that session. When I say session, I'm not talking about hours and hours. You time box it in an hour, you can finish it. If it takes more than an hour, you need to really think about your user story or the requirement. Is it too big? You might have to split it. But most of the time, we have done oopsie within an hour. So in that hour, you say, okay, the developer jumps in and say, okay, these are the process. He'll do the process flow diagram because the developer needs to understand the code. If he is not sure about the process, put a question mark, move on. And then the developer goes, looks at the code, clarifies it, comes back and clarifies it to the team. Then once that's done, then the QA jumps in and says, okay, in order for us to achieve these process, these output and this outcome, these are all the scenarios. And the product owner also jumps in and says, have you considered this scenario? Oh, okay, this is a real world scenario. You need to think about this. And the developer also gives their input. And finally, you also discuss what the input is. It's one of your question, Michael. Can I have the URL? That's the input. You say, okay, in order for me to achieve this, what are the input I need to give? If it's an API, whether it's a get or a post, or what are the parameters I need to pass, or if it's, let's say, MQ based, okay, what is the XML I need to send? Or if it's a UI, okay, what is the website URL I need to call? What are the parameters I need to fill? So these are the discussion you need to have. That's just a very quick overview about oopsie. I hope it answers your question, Shiva.
Yeah, it did. Thanks for that.
No worries. Okay, can I write my own plugin? So your own plugin for what, Dietrich? Is it for NoCodeBDD?
If you can hear me,
Yes.
I was wondering for NoCodeBDD. You say it's no code, so that means no code, obviously. But my fear is that it cannot be extensible. Is the whole project open, and can I, where I need, write extensions for myself or team members?
Yes, you can. We support something called custom code. So you can write your own custom code, and NoCodeBDD will just call that custom code.
Okay, in what am I tied to a language? Can it be Java, Python?
Right now, we support Java, but that doesn't stop us in supporting anything, because we just call whatever programming language in whatever sense you want.
Okay.
We don't restrict ourselves, but currently, we have built it to support Java, but it's just calling Java however we call Java. So however we call your type 2 language, we just have to include that particular piece of code. It's just maybe a day's work for us.
Okay.
Any other questions? And final question, please do leave feedback, because that will really help me to shape future meetups. I am planning to organize this regularly, give more and more into it. I'm also planning to bring additional speakers, industry experts. Jenny Martin, who coined oopsie, is a good friend of mine. I might try and bring her and conduct an oopsie session, but please do provide your feedback. But that will really help to shape this up really well. And if you don't have any further question, we'll conclude this meeting. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks for your time.
Thanks.
Have a great day.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you.